Forced to marry the Alpha King, the rejected Omega discovered the heir already lived within. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Elena Hart. Elena Hart stood at the far edge of the great hall, where the stone floor felt colder than the winter air slipping in through doors tall as 30 feet, and she kept her shoulders squared even as whispers moved like a low tide behind her, the kind that never called her name directly but always seemed to know it anyway, because everyone knew she was the rejected Omega, the one no one chose when it mattered, the one whose presence was tolerated only when silence was required, and today's silence was not something this hall intended to offer. The decree had arrived at dawn, carried by riders who measured distance in miles and obedience in seconds, and by the time the sun cleared the towers, the message had already traveled faster than she could breathe, a command etched into law and expectation alike, that Elena Hart would be bound by marriage to King Rowan Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, a man whose name alone carried the weight of generations and whose absence felt louder than his arrival. She did not look toward the dais at first, because she had learned that hope, once lifted, fell harder than anything else, and instead she counted the steps beneath her feet. 1, 2, 3, grounding herself in the present while the past tried to remind her of every door that had closed. The elders spoke in measured tones, calling it necessity, calling it balance, calling it the kind of sacrifice that kept borders calm and councils satisfied. And Elena listened without interrupting because interruption had never changed her fate before. When King Rowan finally appeared, framed by banners and light, he did not search the room for her, and that absence of recognition cut deeper than open disdain ever could, confirming what she already knew, that this union was not desire but design, not love but leverage. She felt the room tilt, not from fear but from the strange steadiness settling in her chest, a quiet resolve she did not yet understand, as if something within her was anchoring her to the floor, keeping her upright while the world decided who she would be. The words forced and merry echoed without sound, pressing against her thoughts, but Elena lifted her chin anyway, because even a rejected Omega could choose how she stood when the future arrived uninvited. And as the hall watched her with judgment sharpened by curiosity, she took a single step forward, unaware that destiny had already taken several toward her. Elena Hart was escorted from the great hall through corridors that smelled faintly of stone and old incense, the kind of place where footsteps echoed longer than conversations ever did, and she noticed how no one walked beside her, only behind, as if proximity itself was a privilege she had not earned. Servants lowered their eyes, courtiers pretended to examine tapestries, and the whispers followed anyway, softer now but sharper, shaping her into a cautionary tale before she had spoken a single word. She was given a chamber on the eastern wing, a room measured in square feet far larger than any space she had ever claimed, yet it felt smaller than the narrow quarters she had left behind, because here every object reminded her that she was a guest with no invitation, a bride chosen by decree rather than desire. The window overlooked the outer grounds where banners stirred in the wind, counting hours instead of seasons, and Elena stood there long enough to notice how the sky shifted from pale gray to afternoon blue, time moving forward without asking her permission. When the attendants returned, they spoke politely, carefully, explaining schedules and expectations, listing customs she was required to learn before sunset, and she listened with calm attention, nodding as though each rule were a stone placed carefully in her hands. They called her future queen, but the word felt unfinished, like a title missing its meaning, because King Rowan Blackthorn had not sought her out, had not sent a word or a glance, and his silence carried more weight than any command. By evening, the palace prepared for a formal acknowledgement, not a celebration, only a necessary appearance meant to show unity. And Elena dressed in fabric chosen for tradition rather than comfort, pale tones meant to symbolize compliance and peace. As she entered the smaller reception hall, she felt the temperature shift, not from cold but from attention, the way a room changes when someone unexpected arrives. And this time King Rowan was already there, standing near the tall windows with his back half-turned, speaking quietly to an advisor whose voice lowered the moment Elena crossed the threshold. She paused, heart steady but alert, and waited to be addressed, reminding herself that dignity was sometimes the only possession left untouched. When Rowan finally turned, his expression was controlled, unreadable, eyes the color of storm clouds held back by discipline rather than anger, and for a brief moment his gaze lingered, not with warmth but with assessment, as though she were a piece placed on a board whose outcome he already understood. He spoke then, his voice even and restrained, acknowledging her presence, stating the arrangement as fact rather than fate, making it clear that this marriage served the realm, not the heart, and Elena answered with the same composure, accepting the terms without protest, surprising even herself with how natural the words felt. There was no argument, no promise, only an agreement shaped by necessity. And when the exchange ended, Rowan inclined his head slightly, not unkindly, but not closely either, and returned to his duties as though she were already part of the structure rather than a person standing beside him. Left alone again, Elena realized that something inside her had not folded the way she expected, that beneath the quiet obedience there was a growing awareness, steady and unfamiliar, as if her story had not narrowed but sharpened, preparing her for a moment that had not yet arrived. The wedding took place 3 days later beneath a ceiling of pale stone and quiet expectation, not beneath flowers or music, but under laws older than memory. And Elena Hart stood at the center of it, feeling strangely calm, as if her emotions had already spent themselves in advance. The gown she wore was ceremonial rather than beautiful, its weight measured in tradition and duty, and as she walked the 30 feet toward King Rowan Blackthorn, she noticed how the room watched her more than it watched him, as though everyone were waiting to see whether the rejected Omega would falter. At the final step, Rowan stood tall and unmoving, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unchanged from the day the decree was announced. And when Elena reached his side, she did not look up immediately, choosing instead to steady her breathing and listen to the formal words spoken by the officiant, each sentence binding them closer in law even as distance remained between them in spirit. When it came time to speak, Rowan answered first, his voice clear and restrained, accepting the union as required, nothing more and nothing less. And when Elena spoke, her own words followed without hesitation, surprising the room with their steadiness, because she had learned that resistance only gave pain something to echo against. The bond was acknowledged, the witnesses confirmed, and with a final declaration the ceremony ended not with applause, but with quiet approval, a marriage completed without celebration, a future sealed without promise. Afterward they walked together through the palace halls, side by side but not touching, their footsteps matched only by courtesy, and Rowan spoke briefly then, explaining the expectations with the same calm distance he used for treaties and councils, making it clear that she would be protected, provided for, and respected as queen in name, but that his responsibilities would always come first. Elena listened without interruption, absorbing each word, and when he finished she nodded, replying that she understood, because understanding was something she had practiced her entire life. That evening they dined at opposite ends of a long table, measured in feet that felt symbolic rather than practical, servants moving between them like neutral ground, and conversation remained formal, limited to matters of the realm, leaving personal questions untouched. Later, when the palace settled into night, Elena was shown to her private chambers, spacious and quiet, where the walls seemed to listen more than speak, and she sat alone near the window watching the moon rise, noticing a faint unease beneath her calm, a subtle shift she could not yet explain. Days passed with a careful rhythm, Rowan often absent in meetings and patrols, Elena learning the routines of the court, fulfilling her role with quiet precision, earning polite respect but little warmth. And though no one openly challenged her position, she felt the constant pressure of scrutiny, as if everyone expected her to fail at something they had not yet named. Then one morning, while reviewing reports and schedules, Elena felt a sudden wave of dizziness that forced her to pause, her hand tightening against the edge of the table until the room steadied again, and she dismissed it as fatigue, telling herself that adjustment took time. But the feeling returned later, softer but persistent, accompanied by a strange sensitivity to sound and light. And though she said nothing, she noticed how her body seemed to be changing its rhythm, responding to something she could not yet see. That night, as she lay awake listening to the distant quiet of the palace, Elena rested her hand against her abdomen without thinking, a small, instinctive gesture that lingered longer than intended. And as sleep finally came, she carried with her the faint sense that her story was moving forward beneath the surface, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment it could no longer remain unseen. Life inside the palace settled into a measured pattern that left little room for questions, and Elena Hart learned to move through her days with quiet precision, attending councils when required, offering opinions only when invited, and spending long hours alone afterward, the silence pressing gently but persistently against her thoughts. King Rowan Blackthorn remained courteous and distant, their interactions defined by routine rather than intimacy, brief exchanges in passing halls or formal meetings where their roles mattered more than their names. At night, Elena returned to her chambers with a growing sense of weariness she could not fully explain, a fatigue that lingered even after rest, and some mornings she found herself pausing beside the window, waiting for the world to steady before beginning again. The healers noticed her paleness first, offering mild tonics and reassurance, suggesting adjustment, stress, and the weight of responsibility, explanations that felt reasonable enough to accept, and Elena nodded politely, unwilling to draw attention to herself when attention had never brought kindness before. Yet the symptoms continued, subtle but consistent, a persistent nausea that came and went, a heightened awareness of sound and scent, and an emotional sensitivity that surprised her, moments when a simple comment lingered longer than it should have, or a quiet room felt too heavy to bear. She told herself this was the cost of becoming queen in name, the unseen toll of a life reshaped too quickly, and she carried on, determined not to become another problem the court needed to manage. Rowan noticed the change not through words but through instinct, a slight hesitation in her step, the way she sometimes pressed her hand lightly against the table as if grounding herself, and though he did not ask directly, his gaze lingered more often, thoughtful rather than dismissive, as if something about her no longer fit the assumptions he had made. One evening, during a small council dinner, Elena excused herself earlier than expected, her appetite gone, and as she left the room, she felt the subtle shift of attention follow her, questions forming where none had existed before. Alone again, she sat on the edge of her bed, breathing slowly until the unease passed, her hand resting unconsciously against her abdomen, a gesture that felt both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. And when she realized what she was doing, she froze, heart quickening with a thought she immediately dismissed. Days later, a senior healer requested a private audience, her expression careful, voice steady as she suggested additional examinations. Nothing alarming, simply thoroughness, and Elena agreed, though a quiet tension settled beneath her calm. The results were not immediate, the healer insisting on confirmation, on patience, and Elena returned to her routine, carrying a growing sense that something waited just beyond her understanding, close enough to feel, but not yet name. During this time, Rowan grew more watchful, his presence in shared spaces more frequent, his questions still reserved, but his attention unmistakable. And when their paths crossed, there was a brief, unspoken awareness between them, as if both sensed a shift neither had prepared for. The court continued its quiet judgments, some seeing Elena as a temporary solution, others as an opportunity, but no one suspected the truth forming beneath the surface, a truth that would challenge every assumption they held. Late one night, unable to sleep, Elena stood by the window again, moonlight casting soft shadows across the room, and she felt a sudden clarity settle over her, a calm certainty that surprised her with its strength. And though she did not yet know the full meaning of what was happening, she understood one thing with unwavering resolve: whatever change was coming, it was hers to face, quietly, steadily, and on her own terms. The confirmation came quietly, without ceremony, in a sunlit room that smelled faintly of herbs and clean linen, where the senior healer closed the door with deliberate care and asked Elena Hart to sit, her voice calm, but her eyes reflecting a gravity that made the air feel suddenly still. Elena listened as the words were spoken slowly, carefully, each one chosen as if it might break if rushed, and when the truth settled between them it did not arrive with panic, but with a deep, steady shock that traveled through her chest and into her bones. She was carrying new life, a presence already forming, measured not in months yet but in certainty, and for a long moment Elena could only breathe, her thoughts moving too fast and not fast enough all at once. The healer spoke of signs and instincts, of how rare it was, of how the timing explained everything Elena had felt but could not name, and Elena nodded without fully hearing, her hand resting against her abdomen as the reality took shape beneath her palm. When she finally stood to leave, her steps were careful, not from weakness but from awareness, as if the world itself had shifted slightly and required her to learn its balance again. The palace felt different afterward, every corridor brighter, every sound sharper, not with fear, but with meaning. And as Elena returned to her chambers, she understood the danger of knowledge in a place built on power and expectation. This was not simply her secret. It was a truth that could alter alliances, reshape loyalties, and place her at the center of a storm she had never sought. That night, she said nothing, choosing silence as protection, watching the moon rise while her thoughts circled one question again and again. How long could she keep this hidden, and at what cost? Over the following days she grew more careful, adjusting her routines, avoiding unnecessary attention, listening more than she spoke, and when Rowan crossed her path, she met his gaze with the same calm composure she had always shown, though now there was an added layer beneath it, a quiet resolve he could not yet see. Rowan sensed the change more clearly now, an undercurrent he could not explain, and though he respected boundaries, his instincts remained alert, watching for signs that something within his carefully ordered world was shifting. The court, however, was less patient, whispers beginning to form as Elena declined certain events, as her presence seemed softer, more guarded, and questions surfaced behind closed doors, framed as concern but edged with suspicion. One evening, as Elena walked slowly through the garden paths, counting steps as she had learned to do when the world felt too large, she felt a sudden wave of emotion that stopped her cold, not fear but protectiveness, fierce and unexpected, and she understood then that whatever came next would not be faced for herself alone. The realization brought clarity instead of panic, grounding her with a strength she had not known she possessed, and she made a decision in that quiet moment beneath the open sky. She would not run, she would not beg, and she would not allow her story to be written by others again. This truth would be revealed on her terms, when the time was right, and until then she would endure the silence with patience and purpose. As she returned inside, she passed Rowan in the corridor, and for the briefest moment their eyes met with an intensity that made him pause, as if sensing something powerful just beyond reach, and Elena inclined her head with calm respect, carrying her secret forward with steady grace, unaware that the bond between them was already beginning to respond to the life growing quietly within her. The shift Elena Hart had worked so carefully to hide did not go unnoticed for long, because courts built on power rarely miss changes that could unsettle balance, and within weeks quiet concern hardened into calculated discussion behind closed doors. Advisors spoke in careful language, noting her withdrawn presence, her altered routines, the way she seemed guarded rather than timid, and questions surfaced not about her health but about her influence, about what a rejected Omega might become if left unchecked. Elena sensed the change before she heard it directly, felt it in the way conversations paused when she entered, in the glances exchanged just a moment too late, and she adjusted her steps accordingly, choosing observation over reaction. Rowan Blackthorne was drawn into these discussions whether he wished to be or not. Council members framing their concerns as loyalty to the crown, suggesting that Elena's position, already unconventional, carried risk if she proved unpredictable, and though no one spoke of removal openly, the implications were clear enough to make the air feel colder. Rowan listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, weighing words against instincts, because while his advisors spoke of strategy, something deeper warned him that they were circling a truth they did not yet understand. Elena remained silent through it all, aware that knowledge could not be unspoken once released, and she chose patience, trusting that timing mattered more than defense. One afternoon, summoned unexpectedly to a smaller council gathering, Elena entered the chamber with calm composure, aware of the scrutiny awaiting her, and as she took her place, she felt the familiar steadiness settle within her, grounding her in purpose rather than fear. The questions came carefully, framed as concern for her well-being, for her readiness to fulfill ceremonial duties, for the stability of the realm, and Elena answered each one honestly but briefly, offering no more than was required, her voice steady, her posture composed. Rowan watched her closely then, noting the quiet strength beneath her restraint, the way she did not shrink beneath attention, but neither did she challenge it directly, and something in that balance caught his attention more than any argument could have. When the meeting ended, Elena was dismissed with formal courtesy, but as she left she felt the weight of unresolved intent settle behind her, a tension that would not dissipate on its own. That evening, Rowan requested a private conversation, not as king but as husband in title if not yet in trust. And when Elena entered his study, she sensed the careful distance he maintained, the deliberate restraint of a man accustomed to control. He spoke plainly, acknowledging the growing concerns, explaining the pressures of leadership without accusation, and for the first time he asked her directly if there was something she wished to share. Elena met his gaze, her heart steady, the secret pressing close beneath her ribs, and she chose truth without revelation, telling him that change was inevitable, that she was stronger than she appeared, and that when the time came, he would understand why. Rowan studied her then, searching for deception and finding none, and though questions remained, he sensed that pressing further would fracture something fragile but essential. The days that followed were marked by heightened vigilance, council members pushing gently but persistently for assurances, and Elena moving through the palace with careful grace, aware that patience was becoming both shield and test. Late one night, alone in her chambers, she placed her hand against her abdomen again, drawing strength from the quiet certainty growing there, and she understood that the threat she faced was not cruelty but fear, fear of change, fear of power emerging where it was not expected. She whispered a promise into the stillness, not in defiance but in resolve, that she would protect what was entrusted to her, and as dawn approached, she felt a calm determination settle over her, knowing that the moment of truth was drawing closer, whether the court was ready for it or not. The moment arrived without warning, not with accusation or decree, but with the quiet inevitability of truth refusing to remain hidden, and it unfolded in the one place Elena Hart had hoped to avoid, the central council chamber, where voices shaped futures and silence carried consequences. She had been summoned again, this time under the pretense of reassurance, a gathering meant to confirm stability, yet the air felt charged before a single word was spoken, as though something unseen had already crossed a threshold. Elena took her seat with practiced calm, her breathing steady, but as the discussion began she felt a sudden wave of dizziness unlike the others before, stronger, sharper, demanding attention she could no longer deny. The room seemed to tilt, sounds stretching and softening, and she pressed her fingers against the polished table surface, grounding herself as she had learned to do. But this time the sensation did not pass. Rowan Blackthorne noticed immediately, his posture shifting, his attention narrowing to her alone as her complexion paled and her focus wavered, and before any formal concern could be voiced Elena's breath caught, a quiet sound that drew every eye in the room. She stood instinctively, perhaps to excuse herself, perhaps to maintain dignity, but the effort was too much, and as she swayed, a subtle change rippled through the space, something sensed rather than seen, a warmth in the air that carried a presence unmistakable to those attuned to legacy and bloodline. The council fell silent, not from alarm but from recognition, because what they felt was not weakness but emergence, a clear, undeniable signal that spoke of continuation and claim. Rowan moved without hesitation, closing the distance between them, steadying Elena with a firm but careful grip, and in that instant understanding struck him with breathtaking clarity, not as suspicion but as certainty, because the resonance he felt was ancient, familiar, and undeniable. Elena's eyes met his then, not in fear but in trust, her voice barely audible as she whispered that she had intended to tell him when the time was right, and though the room waited for explanation, Rowan did not ask for it aloud. The truth had already announced itself in a language older than council law. And as Elena was guided to a chair, supported rather than removed, the advisors exchanged looks of stunned realization, their earlier concerns rendered suddenly irrelevant. The heir lived, not as a possibility but as a presence already shaping the air between them, and the implications settled heavily across the chamber. Rowan turned to face the council, his expression no longer distant but resolute, his voice calm and absolute as he confirmed what none could now deny, that Elena carried the future of the crown, that her position was not provisional but foundational. The silence that followed was not resistance but reckoning, the slow adjustment of minds forced to realign with a truth they had underestimated. Elena sat quietly as the weight of revelation passed over the room, her hand resting protectively where her secret had become visible at last, and though exhaustion pressed against her senses, a deep sense of relief settled beneath it. She was no longer alone in this knowledge, no longer guarding it in silence, and as Rowan remained beside her, his presence steady and unwavering, Elena understood that the story being written now was larger than fear or doubt. It was a turning point, not born of defiance but of inevitability, and as the council slowly rose in acknowledgement, the rejected Omega who had once stood at the edge of every room now found herself at the center of a future no one could ignore. What followed the revelation was not chaos but order reshaped, and Rowan Blackthorne ensured it unfolded that way, his authority settling over the court like a steady hand, firm without spectacle. He did not raise his voice, did not issue threats, yet every word carried weight as he formally suspended the council session, declaring that all further discussion regarding Elena Hart would take place under his direct command. Elena was escorted not away but forward, guided to a place beside him rather than out of sight, and the difference was not lost on anyone watching. The same advisors who had once measured her worth in risk now observed her with a different attention, quieter, more careful, as the meaning of heir and legacy rewrote their assumptions in real time. Rowan addressed them plainly, confirming that the future of the crown was not theoretical but present, that Elena's safety and position were now matters of absolute priority, and that any prior doubts or private deliberations were rendered irrelevant by law older than the walls surrounding them. Elena listened, her breathing steadying as the pressure she had carried alone began to lift, replaced by a protective presence she had not expected but now felt clearly beside her. After the chamber emptied, Rowan remained with her, his focus no longer divided, and for the first time since their marriage there was no distance in his posture, only attention and resolve. He asked her then, quietly, how long she had known, and she answered honestly, explaining her caution, her fear of being seen as leverage rather than person, and Rowan absorbed every word without interruption. When she finished, he acknowledged her choice not as weakness but as wisdom, admitting that the court had not earned her trust, and that he would ensure they did not forget that. In the days that followed, the palace shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways, guards reassigned with greater care, schedules adjusted to her needs, healers made available without scrutiny, and whispers replaced by formal acknowledgement. Elena moved through the halls no longer as a tolerated presence, but as one openly protected, and while some eyes still watched with calculation, none dared challenge what had been claimed so clearly. Rowan stood with her in public settings, not possessive but present, his proximity speaking louder than declarations, and when officials addressed her they did so with respect measured and deliberate. One afternoon, during a gathering meant to reassure allied leaders, Rowan made his position unmistakable, introducing Elena not as obligation but as partner in the future of the realm, his words precise, intentional, and final. The room responded with bowed heads and careful assent, the shift complete. Later, in the quiet of her chambers, Elena allowed herself a moment of reflection, her hand resting where her future was already growing, and she felt something new settle within her. Not relief alone, but belonging shaped by choice rather than force. Rowan joined her there, standing beside her without urgency, and in the shared silence he spoke. Words meant only for her, promising protection without condition, acknowledgement without reservation, and a future shaped together rather than imposed. Elena met his gaze with steady clarity, recognizing the sincerity beneath his restraint, and though the path ahead remained complex, she understood that the balance had changed. The rejected Omega no longer stood at the edge of the story, and the heir she carried was not a vulnerability but a bond, one that had already begun to reshape power into something quieter, steadier, and impossible to ignore. The final acknowledgement did not come through ceremony alone but through choice, and it unfolded on a clear morning when the palace gathered not for decree but for witness, the kind that reshaped memory and expectation all at once. Elena Hart stood at the center of the outer hall where light poured in through tall windows, her posture calm, her presence steady, and for the first time she felt neither scrutinized nor measured, only seen. Rowan Blackthorne joined her without announcement, his steps unhurried, his expression composed, and as the assembled court fell silent, he did not speak immediately, allowing the moment to settle into shared understanding. When he finally addressed them, his voice carried certainty without force, confirming Elena not only as queen in title, but as partner in truth, acknowledging the strength she had shown in silence and the wisdom she had carried alone, and with that acknowledgement the last remnants of doubt dissolved. He turned then to Elena, not as king to subject, but as man to woman, and in that quiet space between them he expressed what words had not yet carried: gratitude for her patience, respect for her resolve, and commitment to the future they now shared openly. Elena met his gaze with equal clarity, her voice steady as she affirmed her place not through obligation but through choice, and the bond between them, once defined by distance, settled into something mutual and enduring. The court responded not with applause but with recognition, bowed heads and measured assent marking a transition that needed no spectacle to confirm its truth. In the days that followed, the palace adjusted naturally to this new balance, not through command but through acceptance, and Elena found her role expanding beyond expectation into genuine influence, her perspective valued not for lineage alone, but for insight earned through experience. Rowan sought her counsel openly now, their conversations marked by trust rather than formality, and together they navigated the demands of leadership with a shared sense of purpose. As time passed, Elena felt her strength grow alongside the quiet certainty within her, the life she carried no longer a secret but a promise embraced by the realm. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast warm light across the gardens, Rowan joined her on the terrace, and in the stillness he spoke of destiny not as fate imposed, but as connection chosen, acknowledging that what began as arrangement had become alignment through understanding and respect. Elena listened, feeling the weight of the journey they had taken, from rejection to recognition, and she understood that the power they now held was not rooted in dominance, but in unity shaped by compassion. She placed her hand over his, grounding the moment in quiet assurance, and together they looked toward the horizon where future and present met without fear. The story that had begun with distance and doubt now rested on balance and trust, and as the palace lights came alive below them, Elena Hart stood not as the Omega once overlooked, but as queen by merit and destiny, carrying forward a future shaped by gentle strength and enduring love.